In 1927, Mississippi was a place where dusty roads wound through small towns. The hum of engines was still a relatively new sound in rural communities, and the novelty of taking a motorcar taxi carried with it both fascination and trust. People hailed rides without hesitation, often grateful for the convenience of avoiding long walks or unreliable wagons. It was in this environment that a certain taxi driver began to weave himself into the daily rhythm of the townsfolk. His name was not widely known at first, just a quiet man behind the wheel, wearing a worn cap and a patient smile. He would often linger at train stations, bus depots, and the edges of bustling markets, waiting for someone in need of a lift. His fares were modest, his car well kept, and his demeanor calm enough to set even the most cautious passengers at ease. It wasn't unusual for him to strike up friendly conversation, asking about families, work, or destinations, sometimes offering to take passengers a little farther without extra charge. For a while, no one suspected anything unusual. The small towns he frequented were tightly knit, and disappearances were rare enough that when someone went missing, it was often attributed to wandering off for work, running away, or trouble with debts. But there was a pattern forming beneath the surface, one that only hindsight would piece together. People who took rides from this particular driver, especially strangers, travelers, or individuals without strong local ties, had a tendency to vanish. These weren't just one-off cases. It was a slow, unsettling drip of absences that began to stain the peace of the region. The first whispers began when a farmhand was reported missing after leaving the rail station late one night. Witnesses recalled he had been picked up by a taxi heading south, though no one could quite remember the driver's face in detail. Then came the case of a woman traveling alone to visit relatives, her suitcase found abandoned near the riverbank, but no sign of her body. By the time a third disappearance followed a similar pattern, locals started to murmur about a bad road, or a cursed ride that seemed to swallow people whole. The driver himself remained unremarkable to most eyes. His route varied, making it difficult to track, and he sometimes went days without appearing in the usual spots. He had the instinct of a predator who knew when to hunt and when to lie low. It wasn't just random selection. Either he seemed to have an unsettling knack for picking passengers who were isolated, desperate, or unlikely to be missed right away. His method was almost invisible, blending into the normal flow of life, so that by the time anyone realized someone had vanished, days or even weeks had passed. Some who later survived encounters with him recalled a strange, almost hypnotic calm in the way he spoke. He would ask questions that felt casual but were really probes where someone was headed. Whether they had family waiting, whether they were carrying much money. If the answers didn't fit his criteria, the ride would be brief and uneventful. But if they did, the road ahead could stretch into isolation, with the lights of town fading behind and the night closing in. Those who made it back alive often couldn't remember the exact moment when conversation shifted into something more threatening. Only that an unease would creep in as the driver's eyes lingered too long in the rearview mirror. The roads of Mississippi at the time were often unlit, winding through dense woods and empty fields. In such an environment, a driver with ill intentions had every opportunity to disappear from sight. If anyone went looking, there were countless dirt tracks, backwoods paths, abandoned shacks where a man could hide both himself and his victims. In those years, communication between rural communities was slow, and even when someone suspected foul play, gathering enough evidence to act was nearly impossible without catching the culprit in the act. Over time, these disappearances began to link together in ways that couldn't be ignored. Authorities quietly started keeping notes, sketching out names, dates, and last known sightings. Almost every line of inquiry circled back to the image of a quiet taxi driver with a clean car, offering rides at odd hours. Still without a body or a witness willing to speak openly, the case stalled. The most unsettling part was how the driver maintained his cover. He wasn't a recluse or an obvious criminal. He attended church occasionally, bought fuel at the same stations as everyone else, and was even known to give free rides to elderly residents in broad daylight. It was this duality that kept him safe for so long. A man who could be kind and unassuming in one moment, then vanish into the night with a passenger who would never reach their destination. His victims were not chosen out of rage or impulse, but seemingly with calculation, a deliberate patience that allowed him to operate without drawing too much suspicion at once. Even before his crimes came fully to light, there were a few chilling encounters that hinted at something darker. One farmer claimed to have seen the driver late one night parked by the side of a remote road. The trunk of his car open, the driver's hands and shirt stained with something dark in the dim glow of his lantern. When questioned later, the driver reportedly laughed it off, saying he had hit a deer and was dressing the meat. Another man swore he had heard screaming from deep in the woods after seeing the taxi drive past his property, though no one else claimed to hear it.
Ow.
In a time before modern forensic science, before the ease of radio alerts and quick police coordination, such suspicions were fragile things. They might flare up for a week, then fade as life's other demands took over. The driver seemed to know this, trusting that memory was short and gossip lost its edge with time. He would disappear for a while after any close call, then reappear in a different town, his reputation reset. By the time the truth about the taxi driver began to solidify in the minds of law enforcement, the tally of missing persons connected to him had quietly grown. The fact that these disappearances spanned multiple counties made the investigation even harder. Jurisdictions didn't always share information quickly. Each case on its own could be written off as unrelated misfortune. It was only when a persistent sheriff began to cross-check reports from different areas that a chilling pattern emerged. One that painted the driver not as a man caught in a moment of madness, but as a hunter who had been feeding on the trust of his passengers for far longer than anyone had dared to imagine. When local authorities finally began piecing together the unexplained disappearances linked to the quiet taxi driver in 1927 Mississippi, the evidence they uncovered was far worse than the community had imagined. At first, they had hoped to find living captives, victims being held somewhere against their will. Instead, their search led them to scenes so grotesque and unthinkable that even seasoned lawmen were shaken to their core. Deep in the backwoods, far from the well-traveled roads, they found a small, ramshackle cabin that appeared abandoned at first glance. The walls leaned slightly, the porch sagged, and weeds had begun to reclaim the dirt path leading up to it. But inside, the air was heavy with a stench that could only come from decay. The wooden floorboards were stained and warped, and scattered across the room were crude tools, knives, cleavers, and saws that bore unmistakable traces of human remains. In a battered icebox pushed into the corner, they made the first stomach-turning discovery. Wrapped in cloth and paper were what appeared to be cuts of meat, but the size, shape, and texture left no doubt to those who dared to look closely. They were human. More horrifying still was the realization that these cuts were carefully prepared, as if meant for cooking and consumption. Authorities also found a cast-iron stove with blackened pots still sitting atop it, some containing remnants of stews or broths that, under forensic examination of the era, revealed traces of human tissue. The realization struck them with a chilling clarity. This was not just a murderer. They were looking at a man who had been feeding on his victims. Testimonies from locals began to take on new, disturbing meaning. A few had mentioned that the driver would often disappear for days after picking up certain passengers. Returning with large parcels of meat he claimed came from hunting trips or livestock trades. No one had questioned him before. Mississippi in the late 1920s was a place where self-sufficiency was common, and it wasn't unusual for people to hunt and butcher their own food. But now, those same neighbors recalled a strange, almost eager glint in his eye when he spoke of preparing meals, and an odd secrecy about exactly what he was cooking. The investigation uncovered evidence suggesting that his cabin had been in use for some time, possibly years. Bones, many of them scorched or broken apart, were found buried behind the property, some scattered across the ground as if disturbed by animals. Forensic work was crude in those days, but the sheer number of remains indicated that far more people had fallen victim to him than anyone had previously suspected. In one shallow grave, authorities found the partial skeleton of a young woman, her bones clean and arranged in a way that suggested deliberate dismantling rather than the chaotic work of nature. What struck investigators most was the methodical nature of it all. This was not a man driven by sudden fits of rage or drunken violence. The cabin was organized in a grotesque way, tools cleaned and placed in specific spots. Cuts of meat neatly wrapped, spices and cooking implements set out in careful order. It was as though preparing and consuming human flesh was not just an act of survival or desperation, but a ritualized, deliberate choice. Some even speculated that this practice had become a compulsion for him. a dark appetite that drove his selection of victims and the routes he chose to take. In interviews with people who had known him casually, a picture emerged of a man who was at once invisible in plain sight and yet deeply calculating. He rarely invited anyone to his home, preferring to keep his personal life shrouded in mystery. On the rare occasions when he did speak of food, it was with a peculiar enthusiasm, describing flavors and textures in ways that made people uneasy without knowing exactly why. Some remembered him offering small parcels of meat as gifts, claiming it was venison or wild boar. In hindsight, those gestures took on a far more sinister light, raising the terrifying possibility that others had unknowingly consumed his victims. The deeper the investigation went, the more chilling details came to light. Authorities found a ledger hidden beneath a loose floorboard, an old notebook filled with dates, brief notes, and sometimes cryptic symbols. While much of it was illegible or coded, certain entries corresponded eerily with known disappearances. In some cases, there were notations like good meat or tender phrases that left no doubt as to their meaning once the rest of the evidence was considered. This notebook became one of the most damning pieces of evidence against him, revealing that his actions were not impulsive but premeditated, tracked, and repeated over time. Neighbors also began to recall strange smells drifting from his cabin, especially on cold nights when the wind carried scents more clearly. At the time, they assumed he was simply cooking strong-smelling game or preserving meat in ways that gave off an odd odor. Some remembered dogs lingering near his property, whining or scratching at the door as if drawn by something inside. It was only after the truth came out that these small observations formed part of a much darker pattern. Despite the mounting horror, there was still the question of motive. Why would a man with access to ordinary food sources choose to consume human flesh? Some speculated that it had begun as an act of desperation during lean times, possibly after a hunting trip yielded nothing and a stranded passenger presented an opportunity. Others believed it was never about survival, but about a twisted fascination and a taste he developed and could no longer ignore. The ledger, the preparation methods, the care he took in his butchery suggested someone who found not just sustenance but satisfaction in the act. Rumors spread quickly through the region, some exaggerating the details, others perhaps not straying far from the truth. Stories circulated about him keeping certain special cuts aside, savoring them for himself and discarding the rest in the woods. There were whispers that he might have experimented with recipes, blending human meat with more common ingredients to disguise its origin. Whether these accounts were true or not, they deepened the public's revulsion and fear. By the time the full extent of his crimes was understood, the image of the quiet, unassuming taxi driver had been completely shattered. What had once been seen as a harmless fixture of the community was now revealed as a predator with a hunger far beyond anything the town could comprehend. His capture and the discovery of his gruesome activities would leave a stain on Mississippi's history, story told in hushed tones for years afterward, not just because of the number of lives lost, but because of the unimaginable way in which they had been desecrated. When the taxi driver was finally apprehended, the details that came to light exposed a far more intricate and disturbing network of disappearances than anyone had dared to imagine. His arrest was not the result of a single act of heroism, but of months of slow, meticulous investigation by a handful of determined lawmen who refused to let the growing list of missing persons fade into obscurity. It began when a sheriff from one county noticed that certain names in his files also appeared in reports from neighboring towns. These individuals had all been last seen either traveling alone or arriving in an unfamiliar place, and in several cases witnesses mentioned seeing them step into a taxi late at night. That vehicle, described in varying detail, was consistently a modest sedan, with a driver matching the same general description: thin, middle-aged, calm-spoken, with a manner that invited trust. The breakthrough came when a young man who had narrowly escaped the driver's clutches came forward. His account described a trip that began like any other ride, with polite conversation and a promise of a shortcut to his destination. But as the car wound deeper into isolated back roads, the driver's tone shifted, his words becoming clipped, and his gaze fixed ahead in a way that felt wrong. The passenger claimed to have leapt from the moving vehicle when it slowed on a sharp bend, disappearing into the woods before the driver could react. Though injured, he made it to a nearby farm where he told his story. This testimony gave authorities the first concrete link between the missing persons and the driver. setting the stage for a coordinated manhunt. What they uncovered in the days following his capture was a web of movement that spanned multiple counties and possibly even crossed into neighboring states. The driver was not bound to one route or one town. He would work in one area for a time, targeting individuals who fit a certain profile, then vanish for weeks before resurfacing elsewhere. This mobility made him difficult to track and allowed him to evade suspicion for years. Each place he visited had its own list of missing individuals, and because rural communities often lacked rapid communication, no one realized the same man might be responsible for all of them. Interviews with witnesses revealed that he deliberately sought out passengers who were transient laborers traveling for seasonal work, drifters passing through, women traveling alone without known relatives in the area. These were people whose absences were less likely to be reported quickly, if at all. In some cases, victims were not even from Mississippi, but were simply moving through. Unaware they had crossed paths with a predator who had perfected his craft. This pattern suggested premeditation on a level that chilled even the most experienced investigators. Evidence seized from his home and hidden storage sites told its own grim story. Among the most shocking finds were personal belongings of the missing watches. Jewelry, suitcases, shoes all carefully stored away. Some were kept in neat rows, as if catalogued, while others were locked in trunks that had not been opened for years. Investigators believed these items were trophies, physical reminders of each life he had taken. In other cases, they found identification papers that had been stripped from victims, possibly to ensure that bodies, if found, would be harder to identify. The scale of his crimes began to take on almost industrial proportions. When authorities realized how many remains had yet to be recovered, some were buried in shallow graves in secluded woods, others disposed of in rivers or swamps where retrieval was impossible. There were even suspicions that he had accomplices or at least informants who helped him identify potential targets or provided false alibis when questions arose, though no direct evidence ever proved such assistance. Certain gaps in his movements hinted at a larger network, perhaps people who were willing to turn a blind eye in exchange for a share of whatever valuables he took from his victims. In piecing together the full timeline, investigators identified a chilling rhythm to his activities. After a cluster of disappearances in one location, he would vanish and resurface miles away, allowing time for local suspicion to fade. He seemed to know precisely how long he could operate in a given area, before the risk of discovery grew too high. This mobility also meant that his crimes were not always immediately connected, some families and distant. Towns did not realize their tragedies were linked until long after the driver's arrest. Even in custody, the man revealed little about his methods or motives. When pressed, he offered vague denials or cryptic statements that hinted at a mindset completely detached from ordinary morality. Some investigators believed he took pleasure in withholding details, knowing that the lack of closure would torment the families of his victims. Others suspected he was gauging whether there was any chance of manipulating the legal system in his favor. His calm demeanor during interrogations, even when presented with damning evidence, only deepened the sense that he was dealing with the entire process as if it were a game. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational in Mississippi's history at the time. Courtrooms were packed with reporters, locals, and relatives of the missing. Testimony painted a picture of a man who had perfected his approach over years, exploiting the trust inherent in the act of hailing a ride. Witnesses described his careful grooming of passengers, his selection process, and the eerie shift in his behavior once he had them isolated. Forensic evidence, though rudimentary by modern standards, was enough to link him to multiple victims, even if not to every disappearance suspected to be his work. Despite the overwhelming evidence, there remained unanswered questions that haunted the investigation. How many lives had he taken in total? Were there victims whose disappearances would never be connected to him because the evidence was too far gone? Did he have help, or had he truly managed to carry out such a wide-reaching pattern of abductions and killings entirely on his own? The ledger found among his possessions suggested far more victims than could be confirmed, with symbols and shorthand that no one could fully decode. In the aftermath of his conviction, law enforcement agencies across the region began comparing old case files, trying to determine whether the taxi driver had passed through their jurisdictions in years past. Several cold cases from as far back as the early 1920s began to look suspiciously similar in circumstance, fueling speculation that his activities had started long before anyone realized. Some officers privately admitted that it was possible they had only uncovered a fraction of his true crimes. The public reaction to the revelations was a mix of horror and disbelief. Many found it impossible to reconcile the image of the polite, soft-spoken driver with the monstrous reality of his actions. For years, he had driven the same roads as countless innocent passengers, his calm smile hiding the knowledge that some would never reach their destination. Parents began warning their children about accepting rides from strangers, and a lingering distrust settled over the region's small towns, changing the way people interacted with those they did not know well. What made the case so profoundly unsettling was not just the violence, but the way it revealed how vulnerable ordinary people were when placed in the hands of someone who knew how to exploit trust. The driver's capture brought a measure of relief, but it also left a shadow over Mississippi that would not easily fade. A reminder that the man behind the wheel could be far more dangerous than the road ahead.